Good afternoon and welcome to our event. We appreciate you joining us today. I'm thrilled to welcome everyone to Keeping It Brief, organized by the Bucks County Women's Advocacy Coalition. This midweek, midday gathering is your monthly opportunity to get a quick update on a current issue being followed by one of our partners or one of our issue specialists. I just want to make a quick note about our technology today. When you joined the event, your microphone was muted and your camera turned off automatically. You can see and hear us, but at the moment we cannot see or hear you. So relax, grab your lunch or a snack and enjoy today's conversation. If you have a question or comment, feel free to put that into the Q&A or chat box along the bottom of your screen. We'll do our best to check for questions and comments throughout the discussion so that we can try to address them along the way. Around since 2008, the Bucks County Women's Advocacy Coalition is a nonpartisan coalition of individuals and organizations that envision a socially just and respectful society invested in a common good to achieve the potential of individuals, families, and our communities. We educate and advocate to create systemic change. We're thrilled to speak with one voice about systemic public and private reforms needed for economic security and overall well-being of individuals and families in Bucks County and beyond. Before we get started on the conversation, this afternoon's conversation is being recorded. Give us a day or two and we'll be able to access it through a link on our website. You can access this and all of our other past episodes on the past events page of our website. Please also take a moment, if you're new to us, to visit bcwac.org for more information about the organization, to read some of our blog posts and opinion pieces that have been published statewide, to track legislation, and to sign up to receive our emails. And then this educational program, like others that we deliver throughout the year, is offered for free. While the organization operates with incredible efficiency, we do have some costs. If you feel like this program and the work of the coalition is of value to you, please consider making a financial contribution. You can do that through a safe and secure donation on our website or by mailing a check to the organization. Now that we have all the organizational stuff and logistics aside, I am excited to welcome Becky Logue-Conroy. Becky is a doctoral candidate in the School of Social Work at Rutgers University. She's also a research associate at the Center for Women in Work in the School of Management and Labor Relations at Rutgers. She received her MSW from Smith College School for Social Work in Northampton, Massachusetts, and her BA from Williams College in Williamstown, Massachusetts. Her dissertation focuses on the factors that influence fathers to take leave at the birth of a child. Her research interests include family leave policy, social welfare policy, and impact of policy on families, poverty, and inequality. Her most recent published work has been with the Center for Women in Work, examining the uptake of paid family leave in New Jersey. Prior to entering the field of social work, Becky worked in higher education administration as an assistant director of alumni relations at Williams College. She lives in Warrenton with her husband, Chris, and their twin daughters. And just in case that wasn't enough, Becky also serves as the Bucks County Women's Advocacy Coalition's Family Care Act Issues Specialist. So Becky, thank you for all that you do and for being here today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So why don't you just get us started by talking a little bit about what the problem is and why we should care about paid family leave?
Sure. So as we know, we are all caregivers in some way at some point in our lives. So we either care for family members, we care for our children, we care for aging parents, we care for spouses, things like that. And we are also often, many of us, workers. And so sometimes those things come together. We are a worker who may need to take leave at some point to care for a family member, to assist a dying parent, to take a child to regular treatments. And so in order for workers to remain in the labor force, but also to continue some caregiving activities without having to leave the labor force, paid family leave is a really important way to help families to continue their care. And one of the problems is that sometimes in our history, especially in the United States, we have seen workers as the what's called ideal worker type, which is a worker who goes to work every day and has nobody at home or has someone at home who's caring for all of the home things. And the worker just goes to work every day and does their job without thinking of what's happening at home. But as we know, with the growth of families with one parent working, families with two parents working, single parent families where the parent is working, extended families that all live together that need to care for each other, that ideal worker type doesn't fit our culture. It probably never did. And so it's important for us to acknowledge workers as caretakers, and paid family leave is one way to do that.
So I'm curious, what inspired you or got you interested in this at the start? What first brought you to this topic?
I think in college and then during my master's degree, I was always interested in sort of fathers and their relationship to their families. And so I had started thinking about like what happens when fathers take leave, or the non-birthing parent, right? The person who is not giving birth. We think a lot about maternity leave. Many businesses have maternity leave built in. Maternity leave is sort of culturally accepted in a way that other types of leave is not. And so I started thinking about like, well, what happens if fathers take leave? What kind of support can they give? And also in terms of like, you know, supporting the mother and potentially decreasing someone's risk of postpartum depression. If you have help at home, is there a decreased risk of postpartum depression? So I started to think of those kinds of questions. But also, if fathers take leave and fathers are expected to take leave, or non-birthing parents are expected to take leave, does that change the way that we treat mothers or birthing parents in the workforce? So, you know, is the gender pay gap or part of the gender pay gap partly because we expect women to leave the workforce for portions of time that we don't expect men to leave? And does that contribute? And what happens if more non-birthing parents take leave? Does that start to change that gender pay gap? Does it start to narrow that gender pay gap? So I think of things in terms of the way policy affects family and the way that families live policy. A lot of times we think about policy and policy is written in a way that, you know, policymakers may not live within that policy. And so it's important for researchers and for all of us to understand how families live a policy, right? And so we don't think about one type of person or another. And I'm also interested in equity, right? And equality. And so one of the things that I think about a lot is how policy is written, right? So in many places or in many cases, and often even with the policies in the United States, we write policies in a neutral manner, in a gender neutral way, in a race neutral way. But sometimes the implications of those policies or the results of those policies are not gender neutral or are not race neutral, right? So if we write a family leave policy that's gender neutral, but women are still the ones taking it 90% of the time, is that really gender neutral? And how do we shift the way that we see policy and the way that we see the impact of policy? And so that's what I continue to try to look at in my research. So instead of being a sort of everyday social worker working in as a therapist or working in social services, I decided to continue my research and went to the doctoral program at Rutgers to try to continue this research and think about ways that policy affects families.
I'm curious to know, and I did not mention this to you in advance, but so you may, if you need a moment or if you need to come back to me, it's totally fine. But I'm curious if in your research, there's been anything that's really stood out to you as like, oh, that's totally what I expected, or oh, that's not what I expected at all. And you know, from anywhere from you when you first started this exploration to where you are now.
Well, I think there are a couple of things. One is that, you know, again, if you come back to this sort of gender neutral way of writing policy, but not necessarily gender neutral way of living policy, when we see European countries, some European countries, I don't know if you've seen, some of them have daddy quotas or a portion of leave that's reserved for dads. And sometimes there's like a leave that is shared, like mom gets leave, there's leave that's shared and dad gets leave. And sometimes the shared leave increases if dad takes leave, right? So there's incentives for that. So instead of just remaining gender neutral and expecting people to just take leave like, hey, you're offered leave, so you're going to take it, right? But then we see that men sometimes don't take it still, even with a gender neutral policy, but in these policies where it's actually gendered, the amount of fathers who take leave actually increases. And so while that wasn't necessarily a surprise in terms of incentives, I think when we think about equity, sometimes we have to think beyond equality, beyond things being equal. We have to think about what are the ways we can push equity. We can push people to take leave in a different way. And I think that's an interesting part of policy that I've learned over time, that I didn't necessarily understand as well until I really started getting into the research, is that the things that we design as equal aren't always equitable. And I think that is across policy. So I think that's really interesting. And I also think one of the things that I've learned over time is that, you know, there are policies that, again, are written in a way that we think the coverage is across, you know, all workers or things like that. But some workers don't have the ability to even use a policy when it's offered to them. So as you mentioned, I work in New Jersey a lot. I work at Rutgers. The research that we do is often on New Jersey workers. New Jersey has had paid family leave in place for a while, but in July of 2020, they increased their percentage of leave from 66% wage replacement to 85% wage replacement with a higher cap. And we interviewed parents, and there were many parents who said, you know, at 66% wage replacement, because I live paycheck to paycheck, I couldn't budget for that. I just couldn't. We couldn't, as a family, budget for a loss at, you know, 34% of my income, but we can budget for 15%. And I do think there are families who probably can't even budget for that. And so some states have passed paid leave policies where the lower income workers get 100% wage replacement and it graduates down. But the idea that not everybody can save to, you know, to supplement their income, even that 15%, and that when policymakers write policy, they may be thinking of like, well, we don't want, you know, 100 people who make $100,000 or $150,000 or whatever. We don't want to have to pay into a fund that pays out $100,000. But we have to think of the workers who make in Pennsylvania, you know, potentially $7.25 an hour, or, you know, or if the minimum wage goes up, like we need to write policy for those workers, or with those workers in mind, because they're living paycheck to paycheck. And they're the ones who won't take the full leave and won't recover properly from childbirth, or who won't be able to care for a family member, or may leave the workforce altogether, because even at 66% wage replacement or 85% wage replacement, whatever that is, they can't afford it and they can't save leading up to it. I've heard people say things like, well, you have 9 months, you know, the baby's coming. So why don't you just save that money? Well, not everybody has, you know, as we know, there are a few people who have even $400 for an emergency in their bank account, right? So those people still deserve to take leave, right? And still deserve to pay their bills. Yeah. So while they take that leave and recover from childbirth, or bond with a child if they're adopted or fostered, which is part of paid leave bills, or sit at the bedside of their aging parent, or, you know, for the 4 weeks or 6 weeks that person is in hospice, right? We deserve to be the caregivers while still being able to be attached to the labor force. And for businesses, that still is good because they don't have to retrain somebody else, right? If you're gone for 6 weeks, they can figure out how to, you know, how to make up for your work, or to do your work, or to pause your work. And then you come back and they don't have to rehire somebody or spend the money and time to train somebody. I hope that answered your question.
Yes. So as you're talking, I think, I think it may be, hopefully most people understand this, but just on that off chance that there's somebody who's trying to really understand this issue, when you talk about paid family leave, you're not just talking about maternity leave. Right. So can you talk a little bit about who are the people and who are those audiences that should care and why it might impact them a little bit, so people can kind of get a full sense of what we're really talking about with paid family leave?
Sure. Yes. So a lot of times when we think of paid family leave, we think of maternity leave because that's sort of our default way that our brain works. Oh, maternity leave, somebody has a baby, they take leave, you know, we support that, or, you know, well, don't you get that with your job or something like that. But there are so many other reasons to take leave. One of the ways of taking leave is intermittently. Like, so say your child has leukemia, tragically, or something like that, where they need very regular care or some portion of time that they need care, like a week a month or 1 day a month or something like that. You can take the leave intermittently, which means you can take it for that portion of time that your child needs to be in the hospital once a month, or whatever that timing is for the amount of time that you get for leave. Or you can take it for a sick spouse or a sick child or things like that and get the wage replacement. You can take it to bond for things like fostering and adoption. So not just giving birth, but fostering a child or adopting a child, and being able to take that time for a new child coming into your home. And that's for both parents, for birthing parents and non-birthing parents. Sometimes, like in New Jersey, and this gets sometimes confusing to people, but the person giving birth might get a little extra time as their like temporary disability to recover, and then the bonding time, whereas a non-birthing parent or adoptive or foster parent would get, the bonding time. But it also is like, if you have a sick spouse or a sick parent in New Jersey and many of the other states that have past paid family leave laws, the family, the definition of family is who you consider family, is chosen family. And so if you can show that this next door neighbor that you've had for 20 years has been your family, and that you both attest to the fact that you're the family, it's different in every state. I don't know the exact way that you do it, but basically, if it's your chosen family, you can take leave for that person. And so that really is a big deal because some people don't have an extended family that can care for them. And so if someone is your friend or a cousin or an aunt or a niece or a nephew, those people can take care of you just as well as someone who's your child or your spouse or your parent. I think when the laws were first passed, that's kind of how it was, sort of a blood relative that's more like your parent, your child, your spouse. It was very narrow, but the states have continued to expand that definition of family so that you can be covered to care for different family members when things come up. And I think that's really important because we often don't think of the caregiving we do across the lifespan. And we now see, as people age for a much longer time, the care, the opportunity to care and the ability to care and the need to care extends, through your whole life. We care for our parents, we care for our spouses, we care for our children, we care for our nieces and nephews, and we need the time and the space to do that and to create a culture that supports that.
Yeah, it certainly sounds like something like this could really fundamentally shift what caregiving looks like for everyone.
Right. Yes. And I will say too, that as we see with COVID and we've seen across time, very low wage paying jobs like care work, like childcare work, like, care work at assisted living facilities and things like that. Sometimes they're low paying jobs and sometimes they're not filled. But what if we could fill it by taking care of our own family or having that choice, right? You should be able to say like, well, I think I want to put my, or I think my parent would do well in a facility where they can have activities and things like that. Or, I want to spend this last, 4 or 6 or 8 weeks with my family member at home, right? And so that should be something that we're able to do. And we can take some of that workplace burden is not a nice word about it, but, off of like early childhood workers or low wage, sort of very infant childcare. Infant childcare is the most expensive childcare, right? But if the parents could take some portion of time for caring for their child at the beginning of life, could that ease the burden on some of the childcare centers as well? Like if we balance paid childcare and home childcare by having people home for a portion of time, but still connected to the labor force, how can we balance all of those policies together to ensure that children get the best start in life, and that we're able to care for people across a lifespan.
Certainly. Yes, it's funny because as you're talking, I'm thinking about my personal experiences caring for my children where they were born. Both of them were preemies. My oldest was 2 months premature. And I do remember looking at her at one point and thinking, I can't put you in a center. Like, you're so tiny. And then just in the past year, spending a good chunk of time providing care for both of my parents and at some level. So it certainly seems like there's a juggle that's happening. And so acknowledging and looking at what could good look like for our labor force and our workplaces and businesses, it's a certain point just feels logical, but taking care of looking at all of that. So you've done a lot of work and research in New Jersey. And so I'm curious to know, with that in mind, what would you say to Pennsylvania in terms of, here are some things to aim for, or if there's anything you think we should just do our best to avoid, but here's some things to aim for.
Well, I think what we found, and I think this is one thing that's important for Pennsylvanians to know, is that we're surrounded by paid leave states, mostly on the east, but New York, New Jersey, the sort of New England states that, of course, don't border us, but still, they're there. So New York, New Jersey, Delaware just passed it. Maryland just passed it over the veto of the governor. So here we are surrounded by states that are passing paid leave laws. And this has repercussions for workers and for where people choose to go to work. If you know that you're able to care for someone, if you work in a different state, you may not choose to come to Pennsylvania. So that's the first part, is that Pennsylvania should catch up to the states surrounding us. But also, what we've learned and what I hope to see Pennsylvania do is really care about the lowest wage workers and cover them the most at first, right? And so that's in the bill, and that should be, in the bill. But one of the other things we've noticed is that it's not just about the bill or the words in the bill, but it's about how people know about it. So sometimes, New Jersey has had paid leave for quite some time, and not everybody knows about it, or they think it's just for maternity leave. So I think education, I think that's something that I think Bucks County Women's Advocacy Coalition could do a lot of, sort of as these things come about, which is, informing people, once it's passed, how do we inform people that this is a benefit that's available to you? And I think job protection is another thing that is so important. Sometimes you qualify for wage replacement, but the job protection doesn't cover people who work at businesses with less than 30 people or businesses with less than 50 people. Yeah. And so sometimes the lowest wage workers, again, are working in companies that have less than 30 people or less than 50 people, or the hours that they work aren't enough to qualify them for job protection, even though they're qualified for wage replacement. So that's another thing that's so important, because again, if you're afraid you're going to lose your job, you might not choose to take it, even if you know about the benefit. And I think the final thing, in terms of knowing about it and increasing the uptake and having people be able to take it and know about it, is not just having employers understand it, but in having places where people encounter someone who should have knowledge of leave. Like, you go to the OBGYN, they know about it, and they are like, have you heard of this, or have a pamphlet or something? Or you go to hospice and they say, hey, do you know about paid family leave in Pennsylvania once it's passed, right? So, or you go to your community center or to your religious institution, and the person there said, you say, oh, I don't know what to do. I have a child who needs care. And then that person knows, or has a pamphlet or something, and says, what do you know about paid family leave? Do you know that you can take it in cancer centers, So I think of these people as intermediaries, not your employer, who may not be invested in you taking leave, right? Or not just the employees who may not understand it or may not know everything about it, but that there are people who are the ambassadors of leave or something like that, where you learn about it through these places, these other touch points where you could encounter someone who can inform you about leave. And then, sure, maybe they don't know the exact parameters of it, but then you can go to the Pennsylvania Department of Labor website and learn more about it, or things like that. So I think that is really important, that we've seen sort of some of the knowledge is not there among workers, even though they've had access to this benefit for a long time. Yeah, so I think, you know, knowing those things and for Pennsylvania to pass it, like those are the things that I think we've learned from other states that's important to know. And sometimes it's not something you can build into the law, right? So that final thing I talked about, the intermediaries or the knowledge base, is not necessarily something that you can write into the law. It's more something that you can build using advocates and using, you know, ways to teach people how to convey the benefit to workers.
Yeah, it's right, that I think that public education piece, right, is with so many things is so important. And again, as I'm listening to you, I can absolutely think of like those places where you might show up with a sick child who are really and justifiably focused on the child, or you're a parent and really justifiably focused on the health of that patient. And right, what a difference it could potentially make if somebody was paying attention to the, you know, the people who are beside or around them. Right.
Yeah, so, and sometimes you don't have that lead time. You don't always have for leave a 9-month lead time, right? Sometimes the lead time for a birth is 7 months, or you know, 28 weeks or 30 weeks or 32 weeks, you know, and that happens very quickly. Or sometimes the lead time is from when you get a diagnosis to when you have to start treatment. And so having someone who knows about it without, you know, having that same lead time that often people think about in terms of leave and wages and saving and those kinds of things. If you have a medical emergency, you don't have that kind of lead time to think about getting all your ducks in a row and all of that kind of stuff. So whatever you can do to make it easier for the people taking leave is also really very important, because sometimes laws are written in ways that are there to sort of make it easy for the employer or something like that. But when we think about these kinds of benefits, it's important to keep the people who are there to take leave in mind, and also to not have the policy be the kind of thing that all workers pay into, but only the most advantaged workers take. And so we don't want that, right? So we want everybody who has access to the benefit to feel comfortable taking it. And that's the other thing that I would say that I didn't say before, is to also increase the ability of workplaces to have a culture that supports leave. Sometimes workplaces that are, you know, sadly, and it sounds stereotypical, but it's sort of in the research, the workplaces that are more male dominated, or that have, you know, a large male workforce, sometimes the culture is not that of supporting leave, you know, and sometimes it's peers, right? So sometimes it's not your boss or those kinds of people, it's your peers. Like, you don't need a vacation, you know, that's a vacation, or, you know, why are you taking 6 weeks and leaving us? You know, and so to start to develop a sort of a culture of care, not just leave, but a culture of care among the workforce, and not just the workforce that has been the carers for the longest time, but to expand that definition of caregiver to the entire workforce, so that those who really need it feel comfortable asking for it and feel comfortable taking it. Sometimes people choose not to take it because they're afraid because they've heard their supervisors or they've heard their peers talk about somebody else who's on leave.
Yeah.
Right. So all of these things contribute, even if the law is written well, we need to also think about culture and the ways that workers feel protected or feel like they can ask for leave. And, you know, a way for workers to feel like they can say something if they know they have access to the benefit, but they're not getting the right response from their employer.
So are there groups that jump out as kind of like already strong advocates for allies in trying to A, pass this in Pennsylvania, or B, that stood out as really important for its success in any of our neighboring states before we all pack up and leave Pennsylvania? Like, right, are there groups that have kind of already come together to help really advocate for paid leave? And then I think my part two to that question would be that, like, what are there other voices that stand out to you? As it would be really great to get these voices to the table also.
Yeah, so I think, what I've seen is like disability advocates have been really strong. Sometimes, you have someone with disabilities who needs intermittent care, or, some portion of time where they need care, or they have an operation and someone needs to care for them. So disability advocates have been strong advocates of paid family leave. In Pennsylvania, people like the Women and Girls Foundation, things like that, they're really pushing for this, this kind of legislation. So I think those are our places. Domestic worker kind of unions, they're always a good source for advocacy for this kind of thing. Because sometimes paid family leave and paid sick leave sort of go together, and sort of unions and worker alliances are there for both of those things, and are pushing for both of those things, and for the availability of, again, so that workers are safe, and so that workers feel like they can, take the time that they need, whether they're sick themselves or whether they're caring for somebody. So those are the kinds of, and of course, Bucks County Women's Advocacy Coalition, right? So it's, I think we all can be advocates as well. And we can, sometimes be those intermediaries, right? So we can be the ambassadors. If we hear someone talking, like sometimes I hear people talking about FMLA, which is, the federal just job protection piece, unpaid job protection piece, which is not the same thing as the sort of paid leave piece, but it's hard for people to understand the difference. It's hard for people to know when their job is protected and not. So the more people who know about these things, and it is confusing sometimes, and sometimes you are, experiencing job protection through the federal law. Sometimes you're experiencing it through a state law, and those kinds of things. And so, the more that people can understand the policy and understand the benefit and understand, how it works, the better they are able to disseminate that information to their friends and family, right? Hey, have you heard about family leave? Those kinds of things, and to understand that, workers pay a very small portion of their paycheck into it, but it has huge ramifications, across the board in terms of, health of the baby, health of the mother, health of children who are suffering, with sicknesses and things like that. And so, I think those things are really important. And I think, also knowing, I think Tam just said this, knowing kind of what the candidates running for office, what their position is on paid family leave, because in the Pennsylvania legislature, it's a bicameral, bipartisan legislation. Businesses, it's been found in New Jersey and other states that businesses have found that, like, it has increased worker retention, lessened worker stress to have access to paid family leave. And then if it's a paid family leave pool that people are paying into, and it's a benefit like unemployment benefits, then small businesses don't have to pay into it, and therefore they can offer it to their workers, or it's offered to their workers as a benefit, without bankrupting the smaller business or people who don't have the ability. And then they can, have that as a benefit without having to, use a lot of money that maybe that business doesn't have to pay someone, or to pay for a temp or things like that. So I think that's really important to know where the people running for office stand too, because it's going to come up in the Pennsylvania legislature.
Yeah, so there's asking our currently elected officials, but also asking those who are who have their eye on those seats, what those positions are. And frankly, I guess for all of us, that reminder of that importance of paying attention to all the elections as they come up, and not just waiting till after the fact and wondering, like, how did we get here? But really owning a little bit of that journey.
And this is an issue that I think, over 70% of Pennsylvanians surveyed support. I think it's one of those things that, it's not something that you think other people have to deal with. It's something that we all have, even if we don't have children, many of us have parents, we have siblings, we have, nieces and nephews, aunts and uncles. So it's not just that narrow focus, like we talked about before. It's not just the narrow focus of maternity leave, but you know, this broader set of issues for which you might need to care for a family member.
Certainly. And I think, right, as you've described places where it's included chosen family, right, I think that that's, there is this piece of really being able to see how this applies to all of us, because, I can very quickly relate it to additional care that I needed to provide to my kids at different stages, and additional care that I've had to provide to my parents. But I also know, as a single mom, and and I have other single mom friends or other single parent friends, and where we've talked about, like, okay, well, like, how are we going to help each other out when we can help each other out, and the idea of chosen family, and those people who can have a real familial impact on you, I think, is not an unimportant thing, and right, something that certainly is really valuable to how communities knit together and have that, again, not just that culture of care in the workplace, but that culture of care in a community as a whole, and ultimately how that lifts everybody up. So this certainly sounds like this is something that could really support that.
Right. Yes. And I think one of the, very important tenets of any future paid family leave legislation is this idea of an expanded definition of family, because yes, you are absolutely right. Sometimes the people who you consider family are not those, who are, one generation away within your own bloodline, right? So they are people who have been your support for your life, other parents of children who maybe are your kids' friends, or ones that you live next door to for a long time, or those kinds of things. So yes, I think that's really very important.
Absolutely. As we kind of near time, I want to make sure that, I've given you the platform to share all that you wanted to share. One of the things that I think is always important is, like, kind of resources that people might be able to access, where it's good for people to look, things that people should be paying attention to. So from kind of a resource perspective, is there anything that you would say to people right now, hey, look here, or pay attention to that? Knowing it hasn't passed yet in Pennsylvania, but even a little bit on that journey, or where people could be looking if they want to see what others have done.
Yeah, so I think one place that has like a sort of, a base of a lot of the different research and the different kinds of laws that have been passed, and you can compare the laws, is the National Partnership for Women and Families. So it's a place where you can see like a chart of all the laws and how they're different, and you can kind of see, you can get a sense of what the baseline is for the kinds of laws that get passed in the different states, and can see kind of the results. And you can see, one of the things I think is important to notice when you look at these charts is that many of the states that have had it the longest, like California, New Jersey, and Rhode Island, they've changed it over time, given what they've seen in terms of who takes it and why, and what people's experience of it has been. And they've, increased the number of weeks, increased the wage replacement. And so you can see sort of like, okay, well, we can start from this, right? So we can start from a place that's, that's different, that's moved forward. And so, Pennsylvania could get to a place where, we don't have to learn that, right? Yeah. We can see how other states have learned it. And so that's really a good place, a place like A Better Balance. There are some that have more kind of federal focus, but you can get an idea of the kinds of benefits of paid family leave. And certainly the Center for Women at Work at Rutgers. I
know there's some people there who care about this issue.
But one thing that we just looked at was who falls into that job protection gap that I talked about earlier. There are people who qualify for paid leave, but do not qualify for job protection. And guess what? It's the lowest wage workers for whom that's the case the most. And so these are the kinds of things that we can learn, that then we can think about how to make that different in Pennsylvania. We can say, like, okay, how do we make sure that the people who need it the most, or who are at the most risk of having to leave the workforce, how do we make sure that they're able to remain out of the workforce and care for their children? And one of the things that people talk about is finding daycare. Like, I had 12 weeks to find daycare instead of 2 weeks to find daycare. So I really could think about it, especially during COVID. People were saying, like, to have that extra time where I didn't have to think about, like, sending my kid, or going back to a place where I could get COVID and bring it home to a newborn. And so those are the kinds of things that are important. So those are the places that I think people can find more information.
Awesome. I appreciate that. If there are questions from anybody watching right now, please make sure you throw them into the chat. We just have a few minutes left. I'll mention that one of the things that everybody should look for is tomorrow we'll send out a message. And thank you, Becky, for helping us to craft the message. But to our elected officials, asking them and really impressing upon them the importance of passing paid family leave. But certainly as everyone moves towards primaries and the next election season, and it constantly feels like we're in election season. So really all along the way, as you're talking to elected officials or potential elected officials, this is certainly an issue to raise and see where people fall. Any last thoughts that you have that, you want people to take away with them today that you think, if there's one thing everybody remembers, this is it?
I think just knowing that there is a package of policies that help families to care and to continue care and to stay in the labor force if that's what they want. And that paid family leave is part of that and is a large part of that. It allows for care while also allowing for people to remain in the labor force and, continue working and caring at the same time. And I think that's really the most important piece, is expanding our idea of care to,
absolutely,
across the lifespan and for people in the workforce, as well as those who choose to leave the workforce.
Right. And certainly we've had 2 years to learn a lot of lessons, really in a fast and ugly way. And hopefully we have the wisdom to not unlearn them. So
yes, absolutely. Because even when you're home working, sometimes you still need that time.
Absolutely. Absolutely. If almost more so because it's right there.
Yes, absolutely.
It's right there.
Yes.
Well, I want to say a special thank you to Becky. Thank you so much for taking time today to talk with us and share this, and for all you've done to prepare for this conversation over the many, many years. I'm sure you were at Smith College thinking one day I'm going to talk to Ife Aduba at the Bucks County Women's Advocacy Coalition and let me get that foundation built. So thank you for everything that you're doing for this group and around this work. So I professionally and personally really appreciate it. So thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
And
I'm excited to talk to anybody more about it if anybody wants to, or if you think of any questions.
Absolutely. I'm going to also take a moment to offer up some gratitude. I want to say thank you to the Board of Directors of the Bucks County Women's Advocacy Coalition and to all of our issue specialists who volunteer their time following issues very, very closely and tracking legislation. That is the work that fuels this organization. And so we can't do that without you. I want to thank everybody who joined this afternoon and to all of the supporters of the Bucks County Women's Advocacy Coalition. We speak with one voice and all of you make that voice louder and more powerful. So please don't forget to visit the website, follow our work. And when we send out those calls to action, to actually answer the call and take the action.
And yeah, if you're interested in joining the Caregiving Committee, we can always use more people. There's going to be a lot of work to do as this issue comes up and other caregiving issues come up.
Absolutely. If you're interested in joining the committee, we'll get you connected to that committee. I'm sure Becky would be happy to share the workload with anybody. So, and I can attest to the fact that you're sitting around the table with some very, very smart people. So please, if you're interested in volunteering, join in. And then save the date for our next Keeping It Brief next month. Will be on Wednesday, June 1st at 1:30. We'll meet back here on Zoom. And our guest will be Kathy Bennett with the Bucks County Area Agency on Aging. So I'm looking forward to and very excited for that conversation. In the meantime, thank you so much for your time today, for taking this quick moment to follow an issue. Thank you again to Becky, and we'll see everybody next month. Thanks.
Thank you.